So our third and final presenter in this breakout session is Kyle McCaffery. Kyle joins us from Boston College School of Theology and Ministry, where Kyle will be graduating in May of 2021. Kyle's presentation is titled Climate Crisis and Chickens, Moral Formation in a Catholic Worker Community. Welcome, Kyle, and please take it away.
Thank you, and I just want to say I'm honored to share this space with all of you and with my fellow presenters. The first time I visited the Catholic worker community in South Bend, Indiana was November 2013, my junior year of college. One of the staff members showed me their newest project in the basement of the men's house, 24 baby chickens in a MacGyvered nursery of heating lamps and old blankets. 7 months later, I moved into the men's house as a live-in volunteer for the summer. The chickens approaching maturity now lived in the backyard, with a coop and a fenced-in run, where the chickens could wander without pilfering the garden of kale, potatoes, and tomatoes. Theologizing about the moral and imaginative impact of raising these chickens is made possible by looking at some of mine and the community's practices. On the surface, however, such localized efforts seem disconnected from a global issue like the climate crisis. Willis Jenkins' central thesis in the future of ethics is that ethical reflection requires pragmatic, embodied approaches to ethics in which practices themselves train moral agents to recognize and solve problems in creative ways. Accordingly, his strategy, quote, supposes that its most important resources are the tactics generated by communities using their traditions to confront new problems, end quote. As an example of pragmatic ethical reflection, Jenkins references the Catholic worker movement as a demonstration, quote, that ways of love and justice have been opened amidst political and economic powers that would make those concepts almost unintelligible, end quote. Although these localized responses are not wholesale solutions to climate change, their practices testify to a crisis in present forms of vision and action, while working with partial successes to heal their wounded communities. The practices of tending these chickens in this Catholic worker community illustrates a larger aim of the Catholic worker movement, the rehabilitation of humanity's relationship to labor, creation, and community. Although the chickens were fenced in, they needed a roof installed over the run to create some shade and a barrier to hungry hawks and foxes. A staff member, Matthew, and I roofed the coop, which involved climbing on top of the 2x4 structure and hammering sheet metal over the chicken run. Despite bruised fingers and a wicked sunburn, I was proud of my work, knowing that I helped build the protection for the chickens they never could have provided for themselves, one that was strong, durable, and good. I had no prior experience in roofing and have not built any roofs since then. The project, however, was an awakening for me, representing a central message of the Catholic worker movement, quote, to arouse in you a sense of your own capacities for work, for accomplishment, to feel that you and all people had great and generous hearts with which to love God. If you once recognized this fact in yourself, you would expect and find it in others, end quote. In a Catholic worker environment, the community thrives by creating spaces that develop and promote individuals' agency, skills, and imagination. Pope Francis' encyclical on climate change, Laudato Si', describes a technocratic paradigm which has contributed to climate change and continues to hamstring efforts to address its root causes. Instead of cooperative, deeply engaged action, the technocratic paradigm, quote, attempts to resolve all problems through uniform regulations or technical interventions, end quote, that ignore the dignity and reality of localized problems. Francis laments that humanity tries to engineer a technological solution to climate change. Rather, it is technology itself we have not learned to control, quote, because our immense technological development has not been accompanied by a development in human responsibility, end quote. Putting a roof over a flock of chickens plants the seeds for, quote, a distinctive way of looking at things, a way of thinking, policies, an educational program, a lifestyle, and a spirituality, which together generate resistance to the assault of the technocratic paradigm, end quote. Before I went to bed one evening, I checked on the chickens and realized that they had been left milling around the open space of the run, forgotten in the excitement around the birthday of one of the guests. For the chicken safety and sleep habits, they needed to spend every night inside the coop. You cannot, I discovered that evening, talk to chickens as you would a dog or even a cat. They do not go where they are told or come when they are called. Instead, I had to grab a broom and, squishing through the run, which also served as our compost, sweep the chickens into the coop. While sweeping chickens ought not be a regular practice of raising them, the rookie like me can recognize the integrity of creation through such an incident. Simply because humanity designs an environment, in this case, the coop, creation does not become subservient to these designs. Chickens will do whatever they want, eat our kale or lay their eggs in strange places. In Laudato Si, Pope Francis invites the reader, quote, to dare to turn what is happening to the world into our own personal suffering, and thus to discover what each of us can do about it, end quote. My relationship with these chickens required understanding what they wanted, conforming my habits and their environment to meet their needs, and creating the space where our actions would be mutually beneficial. These chickens provided eggs, which were sold in the grocery co-op the Catholic worker ran in the food desert in which it resided. The chickens processed our compost, generating fertilizer for the gardens that fed the house and stocked the grocery co-op. Perhaps most importantly, the chickens became a source of awe and wonder for the neighborhood children who visited the house, and for my unhoused friend Joe, who was reminded by the chickens of his childhood and his grandmother. Sweeping chickens is one example of being formed to recognize and appreciate the non-human world's dignity. The inability or refusal to recognize the entirety of the climate crisis is a result of losing, quote, that sense of responsibility for our fellow men and women, end quote, and for chickens. Our responsibility to creation rests on recognizing its integrity so that we might act in ways that honor its dignity and foster ecological relationships of mutual gift. Chickens express their dignity in curious ways. Throughout my summer at the Catholic Worker, we received several bushels of cucumber each week, donated by the local farmers market. Although I learned about a dozen ways to prepare cucumbers, the 30 to 40 people we fed each evening did not wish to eat cucumber-themed meals every night. One week, we missed a bushel in the basement, and the cucumbers rotted into a mushy liquid within their garbage bag-lined box. I had to carry the box of cucumber mush out of the basement and into the chicken run. Gagging as I tipped the box over into the run, I was mobbed by our chickens who could not wait to begin eating the rotten cucumbers. Watching rotten food consumed with such gusto underlines in a visceral way how much the human valuation of creation can miss reality. Pope Francis identifies how a throwaway culture and consumerism feed off and amplify a culture of indifference towards the planet and the poor. This culture creates a consumptive ethic portrayed as freedom, yet, quote, those really free are the minority who wield economic and financial power, end quote. Commenting on Laudato Si, feminist theologian Catherine Keller explains that this minority obstructs any urgent and collective responses through the use of, quote, high-speed distractions that are slowing down the needed change, end quote. Those distractions, quote, the ruses, the greenwashing, the dismissive realisms that slow climate awareness down to its current international failure, end quote, flow out of the technocratic paradigm, which sees everything in the world as either a resource to consume or garbage to be discarded. We are trained to treat death and decay as problems to be solved or weaknesses to be discarded, rather than the connective tissue of an integral ecology, which sees our relationship with the world transcending death and looking prophetically at decay as the potential for growth. These rotten cucumbers represent the natural space for decay and failure in the world. Although not the final state of the world, this natural decay is evident in our death, in the flowers in our cemeteries, and in every plant or animal we consume as food. Acknowledging this rot as good, as part of a process, and as the potential for future growth sees through the high-speed distractions, particularly those that obscure the injustice of death and decay being inflicted unnecessarily on the margins as the price of the global minorities' comfort with the status quo. The Catholic Worker, as an anarchist movement, does not have a standardized plan or a centralized authority. Each community constructs itself in response to the immediate needs of those around them, incorporating the tradition and principles articulated throughout the movement's history. My moral framework, my spiritual framework, in fact, was molded by this Catholic Worker ecology. Citing Pope Francis' encyclical for this paper reminds me that I first read it that summer while I lived at the Catholic Worker, pondering it as I made yet another cucumber salad. I have not lived at or visited this community in almost 5 years, but its impact has been transformative through my remembrance of these practices in that place. Remembering experiences from the Catholic worker community in South Bend reveals that ecological placemaking, as a starting point for Willis Jenkins' ethical renewal, is not only morally formative, but spiritually transformative in the face of the climate crisis. When Dorothy Day was asked, "What is it all about, this Catholic worker movement?" she would respond, quote, "There are so many people beating a path to our door, I usually try to explain it in simple terms. We are a school not only for the students, the young who come to us, but for all of us. We are also a house of hospitality for worker, for scholar, for young, and for old. But what we really are, and try to be in all the Catholic worker houses around the country, is a family," end quote. As a school, it teaches us respect for the integrity of each other. As a house of hospitality, it creates spaces in which its members can thrive and give of themselves to each other. But as a family, it molds its members in everlasting impressions of love, forgiveness, and resilient creativity. Such experiential formation creates a sustainable wellspring for ethical analysis, discernment, and moral creativity in the face of an apocalyptic disaster like the climate crisis. In carrying a bit of this integral ecology within us, even after we leave the physical environment, we are able to sow its seeds from memory and yield a harvest as unexpected as finding heaven in a few dozen chickens, a sheet metal roof, and rotten cucumbers. Thank you.
That was great. Thank you, Kyle. Yes, clapped. I was wondering, I'm kind of struck by the linkages between everyone's presentations about around animality and bodiliness, and how power and death all work within that. And I think I'm wondering if Kyle, this might be it's a really open question, but I'm wondering if we base our understanding of the Eucharist in something like rotten cucumbers within, and thinking about that in terms of transubstantiation, what does that imply for our theologies? And I'm wondering if you could speak a little more about that.
Certainly. I think from a Catholic context that I come from, I think I'm conscious that today's Friday in Lent, and so we try to be especially conscious of the crucifixion on a day like today. And I think that's one benefit of recognizing the sort of visceral nature of the crucifixion as part of the Eucharist, in that it reminds us, one, that like death and decay are, as I think my fellow presenters have made very clear, tragic, horrible parts of this world that have been inflicted unfairly, unjustly on people, but that it's also a part of this world that leads to something else. And that I think it's very important. I think as I was reflecting on Clara's work, I just felt like recognizing the way in which all of creation can be also crucified within Christ's crucifixion helps us recognize more fully the power of the resurrection, of what that resurrection states for the ultimate destiny of the whole cosmos. And I think that thinking of consuming the Eucharist, and it's not just Christ crucified, but pelicans crucified, enslaved Africans crucified, as part of that, creates a bond that opens us to the rest of the world.
Great, thank you. I think, John, you have your hand up if you'd like to ask a question.
Yeah, I mean, my question is like right along those lines. So I almost want to tell you to just keep talking. But and also I'm like, we need to be friends because this is too good. I love this. I've been thinking about this stuff all week. So, you know, I think one of the things I'm wrestling with is like, where does our eschatology go based on this, right? Because it feels often like the Christian version of eschatology is like, well, death is bad, life is good, so Christ died so that nobody else has to die. And like, I just want to hear you wrestle with that a little more in kind of turning over death as something that's maybe not inherently bad. I don't know if you're saying it's inherently good, but just love to hear you talk more about it.
Sure, yeah, it's certainly not necessarily inherently good, but one of the phrases I used in my paper was to treat death and decay as part of the connective tissue of our integral ecology, to recognize that death and decay is something that we share with the natural world. I think listening to my other presenters, I was reflecting on how much of a scandal just the amount of death and decay in evolution, in the created world each day is part of our world is really difficult and like a really heavy mystery for us to sort of hold on to and wrestle with. Eschatologically, though, I'm so glad you asked about that. I actually, John, if you're interested, I'd be happy to send you my 60-page senior thesis that I wrote on eschatology and the Catholic worker. But I think understanding that the Catholic worker is a place that schools us to see the world in a different way and to create communities where other people can see the world in a different way is, I think, the eschatological mission of the church in the world, to be communities and places where people can go and feel nearer to the eschaton, to feel like they can engage in some of that eschatological communion. And it's something that, because death and decay are a natural part of our world, is not permanent. We can't permanently instantiate that, but we can begin to understand that. And I think that just makes it all the more emphatic how unjust so much of the death and decay around us is.
Noah, yes.
If you would have to, you would have to give one word to the eschatological meaning of death in a space of healing, what word would you use?
No, thank you. That's, wow, a difficult question because I like to use more than one word as many times as I can. But I want to respect your question. I think the word I would choose would be growth. Growth. I think growth is something that says that we continue to emerge, that where we are going is not defined by where we have been or by the obstacles that have that we have faced, but also that it's painful and that it can be something that destroys our expectations for what we thought we would be. Thank you. That's a wonderful question. Thanks, Noah.
Great. Are there any further questions? I think Jenna just put in, gave us a message that we have 5 minutes left. So I think I overestimated the time as well. So if you have any questions for Kyle, I don't know if it would be okay if there are any questions for Clara as well, or Jalen. I think maybe Jalen might have left, but that's okay. So just we want to open up the floor to further questions or connections between the presentations, that would be great. Okay, Jordan has a hand up.
Yeah, hey there. Thanks so much for your presentation. And I was, can you hear me okay? Yeah, I was kind of in and out a little bit, but I'm curious. So since you were part of this Catholic social worker house for quite a substantial amount of time, I'm curious like how you find community sort of after that like wonderful example of community, and or do you carry around seeds from that looking to plant in your own sort of life?
Jordan, thank you for that question. It's something that in some ways haunts me because I think it's really hard to find community like that. It's something that definitely allows me to appreciate when I do find communities that offer that sort of life within them. But at the same time, it's something that I think when I talk about it as moral formation, I think of it as a way that helps me to understand that it's a gift that's been given to me, and I may not have the opportunity to spend all of my life in that community. I can try to bring some of those frameworks and traditions to the places where I find myself, as well as to challenge myself of ways that I grow complacent. But I think it's a dream too. Pope Francis in Fratelli Tutti and Carita Amazonia has talked about his dream for the world. And I think that's an important thing too, to just allow ourselves to have dreams for what our life could look like, and to allow those dreams to inspire us. They're oftentimes not reality, but can play a big role in just getting us through something like the pandemic in many ways, and help pushing us to continue to work and imagine new ways of being.
That's great. Thank you so much, Kyle. So I think when it is 1:45, we'll have a little message to go back. But I have a question as well. I just am wondering, what is the role of waste? Not only decomposition, but agricultural waste, and how do communities like Catholic communities that you've been a part of kind of address that as part of their eschatology or theology in general?
Thanks. I think waste is something that we definitely wrestle with in several ways. One thing was we did most of our grocery shopping at the local food bank, which was often sort of waste food, stuff that wasn't fit to be sold in the grocery stores, things that were considered. So some of it's just repurposing and having a vision to say, like, no, that dented can is not waste. That's still, there's still food there. And at the same time, recognizing that waste is something that has to be managed, has to be part of our process, and that we can't escape it, we can't forget about it. We should be aware of how much waste we maybe generate, and that can help inspire us to find cleaner, more simple ways of living. But also to not ignoring it means that things like finding a surprise squash plant sprouting in the old compost heap can happen. And we hadn't planted squash, but we ended up with squash because it came out of that. So it helps us to understand that waste is not something to be forgotten or made invisible, but it is sort of part and parcel of what having a body entails.